welcome to the Census Data Subcommittee meeting. We're asking that folks put their name and their affiliation into the chat, and we'll start in about 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
We also ask everyone to please put themselves on mute unless you are a presenter or presenting.
Again, welcome to the Census Data Subcommittee. We're going to start in just a minute. In the meantime, if you could please put your name and your affiliation into the chat, we'd appreciate it. And also please mute your phone line so that we don't get any feedback. And again, we'll just start in just a minute. All right, so it is 2:01. If folks continue filtering in, that's fine. Again, welcome to the Census Data Subcommittee meeting. We're pleased that you can join us today, and we have several exciting presentations up on our agenda. I will share the agenda slide after our first presentation, which is from Vince Ossier, who is with the Census Bureau's Geography Division. And he's going to be presenting the Census Bureau's urban and rural classification and overview of the 2020 census urban areas. And we're going to dive right into his presentation because Vince has other commitments back at the Census Bureau. So I'll give a little more information after his presentation. But Vince is currently the Assistant Division Chief over boundary and feature content within the Geography Division at the Census Bureau. His area is responsible for the update and maintenance of the MAF and Tiger database, as well as delineation of most of the geographic areas used by the Census Bureau to tabulate and disseminate statistical data, including the design and implementation of most of the geographic partnership programs, such as the BASS program, Boundary and Annexation program, the School District Review program, the Census Redistricting program, and PSAP, the Participant Statistical Area Program. He was involved in the delineation of the Census Bureau's urban areas for the 2000 census and was responsible for the delineation of 2010 census and the 2020 census urban areas. Vince is also the U.S. representative on the United Nations Export Group on the integration of statistical and geospatial information. So welcome, Vince. Bear with me for just a moment while I unpause my sharing of the screen.
Can you hear me okay, though?
I can hear you. Let's see.
And see me as much as you want to.
Okay, so I think we are ready to go if you can see the screen.
Sure, sounds good. In the interest of time, I'll get moving. So there's hopefully enough time for question and answers. And as was said earlier, Chris Henry, who also worked on 2010 and the 2020 urban area delineation, is here when I need to jump off to help answer any questions. And he is very knowledgeable. So let's go ahead with next. So generally, I'm just going to talk about the history quick and the key 2020 urban area changes with a bend towards the transportation planning community. And then a brief overview of what we did in 2010 and then jump into some more details. I'm not going to be showing many specific UA examples if people are looking, but just setting the stage, because I'm sure people will have many questions because we are already being inundated with questions after our release. The 2020 census urban areas were released as of, we did in the Federal Register on the 29th of December last year. So just in time for the new year. And then we've been trying to roll out spatial products as fast as we can after the fact. So most of the key ones are out there for people, but I know people always want more and other products. So let's jump to the next slide if we can. All right. So the history of the UA delineation just is, it's had many changes with each decade. We've been delineating some form of urban and rural since the late 1800s, 1880s. And the form we're more familiar with started with the 1950 census. It's important to understand just the context, because many of the things people are like, why are these certain criterion changing? And it's in result, many of them have changed back and forth or in different ways from decade to decade since the 1950s. So it's not like suddenly an issue, but everybody feels like that because we only release these once every 10 years. So I guess jump to the next one. So, all right. So with the main thing is I want to set the ground with 2010. So what people were more familiar with for the past couple decades was we had urbanized areas and urban clusters. That was introduced in 2000, the urban cluster concept for smaller areas. And that was to continue or have data comparability, because the 2,500 population threshold, the smallest threshold, is what the Census Bureau had been using since its inception. But we know that there's been a lot of comments that, come on, I'm in a town of 2,500 and it's the only one in the county. It's not urban. So we've got rid of the distinction. I'll get into more details on why as we go along and get into more detail. But the main thing is that even back when we had this distinction, all of them were considered urban areas. And urban areas is, from the Census Bureau standpoint and why we put out the criteria, this is what we use to describe urban for putting out our statistical data. So it's not really, even though people are hung up on this urbanized area concept, especially for the transportation planning community, it really, from our standpoint, was just a threshold, not necessarily a deeply defined number, but we'll get into the reasons why we got rid of the distinction later on. So please jump on to the next one, because I think this is where people are more interested. So these are the things, if I think many of the people on here either have looked at the data that we've released or heard from their various MPOs and other data users about the definitions and asking questions. So I want to touch on kind of the top changes conceptually for this decade, for the 2020 census. So the first thing is, as I was alluding to in the last slide, we upped the population threshold, and I'll get into the housing unit threshold too, but up from that 2,500 to 5,000. So the end result is many smaller urban clusters in 2010 are no longer considered urban areas for the census. That again was because of a lot of feedback we've received on those not being urban and getting more in alignment with the other federal agencies on our definition, as well as things we've noticed internationally working and getting the US definition closer to the international definitions for comparability. The second thing is, this decade we moved to housing units as our primary data point coming into the delineation versus population. Again, I'll get into more detail on why, but that's a key thing. The other is, as I also indicated on the last slide, is we got rid of that distinction between urbanized areas and urban clusters. The other one that has triggered a lot of questions and seeing the actual urban area delineation, the census, is when we reduced our jump distance from 2.5 miles to 1.5, meaning that there's less spreading or connection of non-contiguous urban areas together, which is again in result to many comments we've received after 2010, as well as in the past. And the final thing is, we introduced commuter data into how we split or determine the splits between the separate urban areas. And I'll get into more detail. Just watching the clock, we're already behind a little. So just some interesting facts. So the impact on these changes overall in the urban areas is we see about a 27% decrease in the count of total urban areas, but this is again primarily those smaller urban clusters that really people thought of as more rural communities. Also in 2020, although we saw the raw count of the urban areas drop by 960 urban areas, the decrease was disproportionate in the area actually covered by urban areas, whereas only 4.9% decrease, even though we lost so many actual urban areas. And despite the reduction in the numbers of the urban areas and the total urban land area, we see a 6.4 increase in urban population and a 12.9 increase in the population density. Meaning that the 2020 urban areas have become much more densely populated in general, which we take as a mark of success in our definition, because there's less area that could be argued to be rural in them. Not all, but it's still an improvement in our mind. Next one, at the national level. Slide are you? Just can you jump ahead one slide? Yeah, thank you. So at the national level, nearly 81% of the US population was urban in 2010, and approximately 19% was rural. So for the 20 census, the overall percentages are very similar, as you can see from these numbers. Can you jump to the next slide? So just some graphic examples. So this is a standard example of kind of what we're seeing in the results of the urban area delineation this time. I call it myself urban shrinkage as a result. So based on the changes from the criteria. This is the Dallas-Fort Worth, Arlington area. You can kind of see that some of the farther out urban portions or urban territory have been eliminated, and that's partly due to that smaller amount of urban areas or urban clusters from 2010 being no longer distinguished as urban. But also you can see that in some cases, urban areas that were connected are now separated for 2020. Thirdly, point out, like on the west part of the Dallas-Fort Worth, Arlington areas, you see the effect of the changes in the hop and jump criteria, and a change that I didn't specifically mention, but is part of the hop and jump criteria is we didn't include those hop and jump blocks that would normally be considered or perceived as rural. But in past censuses, we had included those so that mainly cartographic purposes. So there would be a contiguous urban area, but with the increase in data and technology, especially GIS data, that it's much more of a fact or much less of a factor for people to map these areas cartographically. So can you jump to the next one? This is again just another example in the Tennessee-Kentucky border area. You can see along some of the outlying ones where there's kind of appendages in the past are no longer strung out, and that's mostly due to the shortened jump distance that was utilized. But also you can see that general shrinkage in many areas. If there's not actually an increase in development and population in an area, it gives us a truer depiction of urban, because we also this time worked solely at the census block level in our delineation, whereas in at least the past couple decades, we used either census tracts or block groups initially to form the cores, and then added census blocks or qualifying census blocks adjacent to those. In this case, we just started at the block level. So again, it's giving less spread of urban and results in some fewer connections to other urban areas combined with the jump and hop distance or jump distance change. So let's jump to the next one. I'm gonna pass this one quick. This is a paper to refer to if you want to get more into the historical development of urban and rural from the Census Bureau, especially. Jump one ahead. So now I mentioned the specific changes for 2020, but this is just to dive into them a little more and give the reasoning behind why we did what we did. So we adopted a 2,000 housing unit threshold, and that's because it's roughly equivalent to 5,000 people as the minimum threshold for an urban area. And that's because of the 2.5 people per housing unit average out there. Across the US, we know that varies regionally and in various areas of the country, but on average, our geography is, especially urban areas, we're always looking for national comparability as much as possible. So trying to consider the local factors as people bring them up to us, but coming up with a standardized criteria to be applied fairly and consistently nationally. So the other thing I wanted to bring up here is these areas have a higher than average persons per housing unit ratio, including group quarters. So population does get still considered, but only when housing units are not. So in this case, like group quarters, like prisons, like nursing homes, like various facilities where they're not counted as housing units in the census, we wanted to make sure those got captured in our definition, especially when adjacent to the already qualifying urban territory. And so the housing units had a few benefits. It gives others outside the Census Bureau, especially, a way to more clearly evaluate our definition, because it's much harder for people, especially locals, to track where population is or isn't than it is to track the built environment, both on the ground and through the use of imagery. It also gives us the ability, even though we haven't committed to doing it, and Geography Division would like to define urban and rural, so urban areas, at least one more time a decade, because we don't feel that, as the next slide will show, that once a decade doesn't keep up with actual development on the ground, although we're presenting data, statistical data annually through the American Community Survey. So the last thing I wanted to bring up on this point is about the housing units. A big concern going into the census, and we still had it, was the Census Bureau's decision to use what they call differential privacy as a disclosure avoidance methodology. And through those discussions, we found out that populations, they perturb the population data at the block level, so that people cannot be identified by outside data users. So we wanted to make sure that because of that, we couldn't clearly tell you this is the exact population of an urban area now. And so we wanted the housing units are invariant. So they are what was used and counted in the census. So they're more solid. And this also gets into why we eliminated the definition of urbanized area versus urban cluster and put it back on the data users to say how they will define what thresholds they have for their uses, rather than us giving them a clean, less defensible population number per se for these urban areas. So let's jump to the next one quick. So this is an example of just San Antonio area where there was growth shortly after 2010, a lot of development, but because of the vintage of the data we used to define the urban areas, it didn't keep pace even within a couple years after. So let's jump to the next one. All right. This is, again, what I had mentioned about the saying urbanized area versus urban clusters. This threshold to us, and in all the research we found, was defined on the population number of 50,000 people. But we've never been able to find a defensible scientific objective reason why 50,000 was ever chosen. And so it's important, like, to note that when we've done comparisons about like economic data for these areas, their importance, both regionally and economically, don't really change much based on that threshold. From like 40 to 51,000 are very similar. So yet another reason why we don't want people necessarily to hang their hat on that 50,000 threshold, and give some other thought between how they define their thresholds. Let's jump to the next one. This again, I had mentioned about the shortening of the jump distance from 2.5 miles to 1.5 for this census. We proposed it in 2010. It actually was adopted in 2000. So we proposed eliminating it for 2010, but there were enough people that said, no, let's keep it. And we proposed it again for 2020. And after seeing the results of the 2010, especially because we had adopted land cover data, especially water and wetlands data coming into 2020, that there was already the perception that we were overextending individual urban areas. And combining the land cover with the larger 2.5 mile just made things string together too much. And that's why we ended up reducing it after proposing it for the 2020 census. All right, please jump to the next one. The last thing here is that split criteria I had mentioned. We had had problems in the past in the logic and defensibility of how we split urban areas. You know, there's always some group of people, more academics, that say, don't split them at all. Just keep all the aggregations together. And then you end up having an urban area extending from Boston to Washington, D.C., basically. And that doesn't serve most people's needs, especially on the local perspective. So we have to have some way of splitting these into better or more locally defined urban areas. but we had been using the core-based statistical areas, or better known as the metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas, to do that, and they're built on counties. So those areas are built using the urban areas, and then it was too circular in our logic to say, then we split them using the, not from the urban areas, going to the CBSAs, and then using the CBSAs to split the next round of urban area wasn't defensible enough. So we came up with a reason, or a method, using some other census data, the loads data, the longitudinal employer household dynamic origin destination data set, which is basically commuter flows at the block level, built on state employment records that are provided to the Census Bureau, so that we can determine these flows. We found algorithms that had been utilized externally to the Census Bureau that could be applied to these to build traffic flow, commuter flow areas that provide better distinctions between where we want to split between the various urban areas. So can you jump to the next slide quick? So this just shows, like, one area we've always looked at is the Baltimore-Washington split, and how there were many arguments from people who actually live in that area, as well as interested folks, just saying, no, you should make the split here, no here. And this gave us a data-driven way of finding these splits. It didn't end up really creating new or merging together urban areas. It just placed the splits in better locations according to this data. So, all right, let's, in the interest of time, just another example on splitting. This is the Charlotte, North Carolina, South Carolina area, and just take note of the Rock Hill area down to the south. Like, according to the commuting data, it changed pretty drastically between where the split is, and it ends up being coincident more or less with the county and state boundaries. So just something to take note of. Let's jump to the tables quick. I'm gonna skip over these because we're out of time, and these are no surprises to most people that the top 10 urban areas are still more or less the same. The only difference is Philadelphia and Houston kind of switch places around Dallas. Can we jump to the next slide? Again, the most dense urban areas. A surprise in some ways to us in 2010 was that California really had some very dense urban areas, especially in terms of population. I think of more stereotypically the Northeast of the United States to have those, but California has a lot, and that pattern was reflected again in 2020. Quick jump to the next one. I think these are the ones many of the transportation planners are interested. So we brought up those that were hovering around 50,000. Even though we don't consider our criteria and our delineation based around any programmatic needs, we know that the 50,000 threshold is very important, especially with the transportation planner community and the MPOs. So we made an extra effort to look at those areas when we were developing criteria and doing the delineation. but we had to make sure to treat everyone equally, fairly, and defensively. So these were the results of those few out of the total number that fell below 50,000. This in the next slide. These are ones that in some cases, like Cumberland, Maryland area and New Bern, North Carolina, no matter what we did, they've just lost large amounts of population in there. And we couldn't, no matter how it was delineated, it just couldn't go back over the 50,000. The others are more through potentially other changes in the criteria having an effect, especially jump distance, moving to the block level, just that general urban shrinkage was just enough to put them under 50,000 this time. Can we jump to the next slide too? All right, so these are distinct larger urban areas that it was the criteria in general changes, but especially the shortening of the jump distance that did not connect these areas. The only one we've heard from already is the Carbondale, Illinois one. And we've provided them details on that, but not heard back. I'll jump to the next one. This one I know is important to many data users, again, especially the transportation planning community, but we're less certain of because we know even within the transportation planning community, generally we find mass transit people do not like going over 200,000, yet the MPO general car transportation people want to go over 200,000. So even though we took note of these, we definitely did not lean one way or another in how we reviewed these areas. They are what they are, but there were quite a few that have jumped over 200,000 since 2010. And we know this is important to the planning community. Can we jump one more? There were only two, even though Norwich, New London is quite large, that fell well below 200,000 for various reasons. And just to take note of these. Lastly, one other slight criterion change is we required urban areas to have a high density nucleus, like basically the stereotypical downtown of a urban area, to remain as an urban area. And these were the ones that we found that never had a core, and so were eliminated in the 2020 delineation. I don't think any of these are things this community will hear from, but just to be aware of it. So let me jump to the last slide. I gotta run, but are there questions? And then again, I'll ask Chris Henry here to join me in answering any of them. I think I can do like maybe 5-10 minutes.
So Christina asked, is there an ETA for the spatial piece?
It's out there. So the shape files, the Tiger Line shape files and the Tiger web application are out there and live on our website now. Let me see, I can.
Well, we might be able to get that link from you at some other point if that's.
Yeah, I've got it here actually. So you can, there's links off our urban rural page, but let me paste it here in the. go to this page. This is where there are links to both the Tiger Web and Tiger Line files now. If you need any help and are having trouble getting confused, please send emails to the mail address here indicated on the question screen. Sorry, you jumped to the next one.
I did jump, but I put some of the links to the urban rural pages.
Okay, cool.
Up
Thank you.
there. So
In the interest of time, do you need to jump to the next presentation anyway?
Actually, let me give you a couple more questions, or for you or for Chris.
Yep.
Keith asked, is there any way to get contemporaneous data for the 2020 urban areas and the corresponding 22 UA? This is important in order to tell how much of the change between years is due to changing characteristics versus changing geographies.
No, sounds like a research project. You're asking between 2010 and 2020?
Yes.
Yeah. No, with our bandwidth, no. I mean, we don't have time to do any of that. But the data's out there if you want to. So.
Okay. We did get a question from Guy from ARC. Are the urban areas final, or are you open to feedback from locals?
We cannot, because I know the transportation community, especially the MPOs, are a major user. There's so many definitions of urban and rural out there in programs and legislation that we can't listen to direct criticism of any one area, because we can't change it. It's already been delivered for statistical data tabulations. And we've had many invites to congressional meetings over the decades with this. And one I remember fondly was Senator Lugar from Indiana was getting a lot of pressure from constituents to include airports in the urban areas. We told them we'd look at it because it was early enough in the process, and to see if there was a consistent, objective way that it could be done. And we determined there was. And so he ended up happy, and those constituents, we released the data, and he heard from an army of other data users that said, why did you do this? We've lost funding for these programs. It's just the only way we can make a change is if there's a determination that our criteria was not implemented correctly in an area. So we get questions about specific blocks for specific urban areas. We try to answer those as quickly as we can, but the more we get, the slower the responses will get, and the more detailed the request. So people challenged all sorts of things in the past. In 2000, there were some corrections made to urban areas, but less than 10 corrections nationally. And then in 2010, no one was able to find any actual misapplication of the criteria. So no change was made. This decade, we're waiting and hoping and praying that someone won't find a successful fix. But I can tell you it's not going to be very much, if any. And it won't be the sort of things we're hearing from data users now where they just want this area in, they don't want that area. We can't do anything on our side with that. And we ask and have them work with whatever programs they're working on to adjust their use of the urban areas so that it can be more beneficial to those data users. But we know that's not always very successful either. So.
Okay.
Great.
One more, Yenping said, when deciding urban areas, do you take into account the population that lives in group quarters?
Yes. But it doesn't honestly have a huge effect, right? Like it's only where there's, say, a block adjacent to something already qualifying as urban. And then it could qualify with enough population where it wouldn't have qualified on housing units because of the group quarters.
I know we have to move on with the rest of our meeting. For those who have already asked other questions in the chat, we may return to this topic, or we will try to get these questions answered over the next few days and send it out.
Okay,
Clara?
thank you. And Chris is here to remain, and I'll try to jump back after my meeting in case there's anything at the end of the meeting.
Thanks so much, Vincent.
Great, thank you, Vincent. So I wanted to actually circle back and formally introduce the meeting because we wanted to make sure we had time to get Vince's presentation in before he had to go on to his next meeting. Kathy, you and me, Clara Rashevsky, are the co-chairs of the Census Data Subcommittee. We reside under the Urban Data Committee as part of TRB's data section. So that's sort of the arrangement under which we are meeting here today. We opted to continue in a virtual environment as opposed to in person at the TRB annual meeting, which was 2 weeks ago, because we know that a lot of you are unable to attend the annual meeting in person, and we wanted to make sure that you still had an opportunity to participate in the Census Data Subcommittee, because a lot of the topics that we tend to cover are of interest to people who work at MPOs and state DOTs across the country. So with that, we are going to move on to our next presentations. And at the end, if we have any time, we can open it up to general questions, including questions for Vince and then Chris Henry, who is here with him as well. But first, let me actually pause sharing and can't get to it. Well, anyway, Penelope Weinberger works for AASHTO, and she will be providing the update on the CTPP and commuting in America. Penelope has worked for AASHTO for about 15 years. She runs and is sort of the personification of the CTPP program. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Penelope.
Thank you, Clara. Of course, it's all bait and switch because Kyla Elzinga of AASHTO will be giving the update. Kyla is the Associate Program Manager for Data and Planning at AASHTO. She's been with AASHTO for just under 2 years, and she is a huge spine and support to the CTPP and many other initiatives. So Kyla, it's all you.
All right, thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Kyla Elzinga. Like Penelope mentioned, work with her at AASHTO. So I'm going to do a quick update here, and then Penelope is also available for questions or additional color commentary or anything else we need for this quick update. So a few items on the CTPP program. So first of all, I want to share that the CTPP program has been working with the Census Bureau on the new tab request for the 2017 to 2021 data set. We don't have any updates on timeline at this point, but conversations have been ongoing, and we hope to have more information to share soon. Additionally, CTPP has been working on a new data access software. So we are planning for that to be released this summer, so summer 2023, along with a new API, which will be a new feature for the program. AASHTO internally is undergoing some marketing updates, including new logos for all of our technical service programs, which include CTPP. So stay tuned for more information on kind of new marketing on the program. I also wanted to share about some of our live monthly trainings. So we launched live monthly trainings in September 2021. We continued those until last December. So we're currently paused on that while we await the new software and some new updates to the training materials. But we may have a few research spotlight sessions this spring, so stay tuned for more information on that. I also wanted to share that the CTPP board has a strategic meeting in February. So one component of that will be looking at the next 5-year program. So state members should be getting some advance notice of what funding requests will look like later this spring. So those are some quick CTPP updates. Also wanted to share a little bit about Commuting in America briefs. So there were 2 released last year, one on the evolution of households and the second on emerging modes and how to measure them. So those are available on the website, and I'll put some links in the chat as well. We have 2 that are in the final stages of publication. So one on change and variation in mode choice, and then one on machine learning approaches for populations hard to capture commuting behavior. And then we have 2 more that are currently under contract and in development, one on rural commute patterns, and then one on approaches to examining equity in commuting. So I'll put some information in the chat, including the CTPP website. I did also want to mention that the website for this TRB subcommittee is in the process of being migrated over to the CTPP site. So that information is currently being moved over, and you can find that at the CTPP website in the future. I'm happy to answer any questions. Penelope is also here. I know I have to hop off for 3 o'clock, but I'm happy to answer any questions if there's anything with those quick updates.
So there are no currently questions in the chat. I didn't know if anybody wanted to turn on their microphone and ask a question at all for Kyla.
So one thing I do want to do, if we have an extra minute and if there are no questions, I know that Colby of the Manhattan Group is on the call. And Colby, if you could unmute and turn your camera on. Colby is working on helping coordinate the development of the new CTPP software in the API. And the Manhattan Group just oversaw a hackathon. So Colby, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Kyla mentioned the API. We're really excited about that. And we just wrapped this process up basically in the fall. Between October and December. We received a draft API from the vendor, tested it internally, and then gave it out to real transportation planning practitioners in the community to see what they could build using their coding and scripting skills. And we had some fantastic participants, 3 of which were selected by an awesome team of judges as the winners. And first place was a team from PSRC that actually developed a cool library for R that you can use to access the CTPP data in a manner that's actually quite similar to the very popular Tidy Census library that some of you may be familiar with already if you're a coding scripting person and using census data for transportation planning a lot. So we've taken some great steps in that direction. And we will be sharing, yes, somebody in the chat said, can you share a link to the R code? I was just trying to share a flyer that we produced that was handed out at the AASHTO TRB table, but I couldn't paste it into the chat. So if it's possible, I'll email the organizers after this, and can you distribute that flyer along with the other presentation materials? And then people can follow the links on that flyer for more information about the specific submissions and more about our overall sort of data access tools update program.
Yes, we can share that for you.
Wonderful. I think that's it for me. People can get more information about the material that will be sent out.
And then, of course, watch your email inboxes and the CTPP listserv coming a little bit ahead of June, when we're going to start to put the word out looking for more beta testers.
Oh, sooner than that, I forgot to mention, actually, we're going to have the user interface. We did the API, but we're actually getting the user interface this spring, maybe as soon as February. So yeah, watch your email inboxes. We actually have a link to sign up on our webpage at manhattan.co. In the top right, there's a CTPP link. You can go there, and there's a form. You can sign up to be a beta tester. Sorry to cut you off, Penelope, but I didn't want people.
And that was sent out on the CTPP listserv, which is in the CTPP listserv archives, which you can find. And let's see, just remember, the more we break it, the better it will be when it launches. Thank you, Clara and Kathy.
Great. Thank you, all 3 of you, for that update. We're going to move forward. Our next pair of presenters are from the Census Bureau's Journey to Work and Migration Statistics Branch. They are Michael Burrows and Charlene Bird. I'm going to give you a brief bio for both of them and then toss it over to Michael to share slides. Michael Burrows is going to present on trends in home-based work, drawing on 15 years of data from the ACS. Michael is a survey statistician who is studying commuting and migration at the Journey to Work branch. He works primarily with the ACS and the SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, and on the Decennials Island area censuses. Before the pandemic, he commuted by public transportation, but has migrated 3 times since early 2020. And now he works from home in Maine. Lucky. Prior to joining the Census Bureau, he obtained a PhD in public policy and sociology at Duke University, where his research focused on population development and environment. Charlene Bird is going to present on ACS commuting content discussion, which we will get into in just a few minutes. And Charlene is also a survey statistician in the Journey to Work branch. She works primarily on the ACS with experience in both commuting and migration topics, and she has a doctorate degree in geography from the University of Tennessee. So with that, Michael, I will pass it over to you to give your presentation.
Thank you. Just looks like there's a little hiccup with the sharing, so I'm trying to start that over real quick. Hopefully we'll just take a second. And is that coming through?
Yes.
Great. All right. So good afternoon. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak on work from home trends and later on our commuting content. So we're really excited after a brief hiccup due to 2020 data collection issues related to the pandemic. We're now able to offer 15 years of commuting data. I'm Michael Burrows. I am here today with Charlene Bird and Brian McKenzie, with whom I understand many of you are a lot more familiar and have been with the branch much longer. I've been with Journey to Work for about 5 years now. But we're really excited to get to the point where we can start sharing some of the results of the work that we've been doing for the last few years when it's been a little harder to get these results out into the public. So in the presentation ahead, I'm going to focus on 2019 and 2021 estimates. Again, that's due to the effect of the COVID pandemic on data collection, which resulted in lower survey response rates. And again, many of you are probably already familiar with some of this, but to put a long story short, those who responded to the survey in 2020 had different characteristics than those who did not. And this resulted in estimates that were considered inconsistent with benchmarks and administrative data. So rather than release these estimates using standard methodology, the Census Bureau created experimental estimates using a new weighting methodology aimed at mitigating non-response bias. Rather than comparing 2021 estimates to 2020 experimental estimates, the comparisons that I'm using in this presentation are made between 2021 and 2019 data, which use consistent weighting methodologies. You'll also notice that in the slides ahead, I'm presenting commuting data from Maryland alongside our national estimates. And this is because we used many slides in this presentation for an earlier presentation to the Maryland State Data Center. I do think, however, that these data add a little extra nuance to the conversation, given some of the unique geographic, transportation, and labor force characteristics of Maryland. So I will point that out along the way, where I think there's some particularly interesting variation going on between the national and the Maryland estimates. I also want to mention that we have a report on home-based work scheduled for release in March. It'll go a lot deeper into some of the pretty fascinating national trends on work from home that we've seen since the onset of the pandemic. And it should be accompanied with, in time, with some shorter stories going into some subtopics that we found pretty interesting. So all that being said, let's move on to look at some of the commuting and work from home trends. So on this slide, we see how people in the US and Maryland traveled to work in 2021. Looking first at the US, I think the numbers to pay attention to in particular are those for driving alone. About 2 in every 3 workers drove alone to work in 2021. For public transportation, which represented about 1 in every 40 workers, and working from home, 1 in every 5 to 6 workers. And it's notable that that number for working from home in Maryland is about 1/3 again higher for working from home. So looking at driving alone to work, it's been pretty stable since the start of the ACS. In 2021, it was still by far the most common way to get to work. But at the national level, it still dropped by about 8 percentage points from 3 and 4 workers in 2019 to the 2 and 3 we saw in 2021. As we stated in a press release with the release of the 2021 one-year data, this corresponded to nearly 15 million fewer people commuting alone by private vehicle. So on a typical workday, about 15 million fewer cars on the road at the national level. So some other less common means of transportation also fell, including public transportation. Looking just at the national level, the effect of the pandemic in relative terms was enormous on public transportation. At the national level, the share of workers commuting by transit was cut in half to 2.5%, after hovering at about 5% for over a decade. For our purposes, and many of you who are familiar with our questionnaire already know, public transportation includes bus, subway or elevated rail, long distance train or commuter rail, light rail, streetcar or trolley, as well as ferry boat. So there's a pretty wide range of public transportation options. And the mix of them is pretty different from place to place, which in turn generates some very wide variation in transit commuting in different geographies. Maryland is actually a pretty helpful example here with its relatively high share of workers commuting by transit before the pandemic, up at about 8%, and an even more precipitous drop down to about 3% in 2021. So people who work from home are not included in the universe for travel time. So what we're seeing here is an average of the reported one-way travel time among workers who do not work from home. So the geographies in this chart also refer to the places people live and not necessarily where they work, in cases where people commute out of their state or metro, which is actually more common in Maryland, for example, than it is in many states or at the national level. So travel time in minutes dropped to its shortest in about a decade at the national level in 2021. So commuters on average experienced the shortest commutes in about a decade. I'll mention too the drop in Maryland, which was much steeper. And I think it contributes to our understanding of how different geographies have experienced the effect of the pandemic somewhat differently. Past analysis, including a paper we put out a couple of years ago, showed a strong relationship between different modes of transportation and travel time. For example, public transportation is associated with some of the longest commutes. So we would expect to see higher travel times in places where more people take public transportation, such as Maryland, the state, before the pandemic, and of course the DC Metro, which is one of the top metros in the nation for public transportation. So the higher travel time before the pandemic and the somewhat steeper drop is unsurprising in this context. So we turn now to working from home, the source of a lot of interest these days. And first, we're looking at the long-term trends. Kind of unsurprisingly, again, working from home spiked in 2021. We're skipping over 2020 due to the experimental nature of those data. And the nature of the question is somewhat limiting in terms of capturing the full extent of working from home, since we're asking people how they usually get to work. So at the same time, it's still striking that the rate is about 3 times higher at the national level in 2021 compared to 2019 for those that primarily work from home. So one might assume that many people who occasionally work from home wouldn't be included in this, although that we can't speak to that using ACS data. Although there are other Census Bureau data sources that do provide that information, such as the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or the SIP. So who is working from home? And again, we have a report coming out in a couple of months that will speak to this in a lot more detail. But we learned prior to the pandemic that home-based workers tended to be older than their commuting counterparts. This is an interesting finding in a report on the commuting habits of older workers that was published in late 2020, I believe. So here we have the median age of home-based workers in 2019 and 2021. At the national level, that statistic of median age dropped by about 4 years, indicating that the overall home-based workforce was much younger in 2021 than it was before the pandemic. So this is just one way that we've observed the characteristics of the home-based workforce converging somewhat with the overall workforce, which, as information, was just under 42 years old, both in 2019 and 2021. In other ways, though, the demographics of the commuter and home-based workforce are diverging, not converging. And one of these ways is the prominence of women. So the prominence of women among home-based workers distinguishes this group from commuters. At the national level, women are about 3 percentage points more likely to work from home than men. In Maryland, that difference is even a little bit greater. Our public tables do show that there was a distinction in these rates before the pandemic as well. But the difference in rates is greater in 2021 than it was in 2019, indicating growth in the share of the home-based workforce that is composed of women. So this next slide was initially designed to show how Maryland metros compared to some key metros nationally, but I think there's enough information here that it should be interesting to this audience as well. I've only included a few non-Maryland metros for purposes of comparison, but in general, it's been notable to observe the dramatic expansion of home-based work in metros that are known for their connection to the tech industry, such as San Francisco, which was, per our press release, one of the top metros for working from home in 2021, as well as San Jose, which is quite close and linked to the same industries. In the DC metro, which is very close to that top ranking, the very high rate of working from home that we see in DC is again kind of linked to the occupational characteristics of the DC metro, namely the connection to the federal government. At the onset of the pandemic, the federal government kind of quickly and uniformly switched to remote work for many of its employees. So other metros that have kind of more of a mix of occupations and industries like New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, they're still above the national average, but much less strikingly so. Then we might just expect to see metros and other geographies with more sort of industrial, manufacturing, defense, or tourist and service-based economies lower down on the distribution, like we see Virginia Beach here. So overall, the trends that we've been outlining since the start of the pandemic in terms of how people are getting to work, I think what jumps out is first, this declining share of drivers and transit riders, which potentially has some interesting implications for investments in both. Next, we see shorter travel time for commuters. This is potentially good news for people on the road, although it's likely also a reflection of fewer people traveling by the kind of less resource intensive, but more time intensive modes like public transportation. Next, and unsurprisingly, we see that rising share of home-based workers who are themselves increasingly made up of younger workers and of women. And last, we see a lot of variation in the share of workers who work from home, which is observable through geographical variation, the share in each metro, but also likely to be more a function of the predominant occupations and industries within the geographies that we're looking at. So a keen understanding of occupation and industries is closely linked to the share of workers that work from home. So moving away from some of the trends and looking at some of the content specifically, we're going to turn now to look at the means of transportation to work question in the American Community Survey. And just to briefly introduce before we hand things over to Charlene for discussion, commuting questions first showed up on census surveys in 1960. So this is part of a pretty long lineage of collecting close to identical information. So on the left here, we see the question in the 1960 decennial census long form. Because it was in the long form, that meant a sample of the population was asked one or more questions related to commuting. In 1960, the question was limited to this means of transportation to work question. By 2000, the question set had expanded to be more or less the same as what we see on the ACS, which is to say after 2000, it disappeared from the decennial and is only on the ACS. But you can see from these two examples here that there actually aren't that many changes between the means of transportation to work question in 1960 up to today. And this is the current question format from the 2021 ACS. So many of you will already be familiar with this. And here are a few of the recent changes that it's gone through just in the last few years. And now with an eye toward the future of the means of transportation to work question, I'm happy to hand things over to Charlene to lead us into some discussion.
Thanks, Michael. I want to give folks an opportunity, or at least us a chance, to respond to some questions that were in the chat box. As Michael mentioned, the work from home question collects the primary means of transportation. The means of transportation question collects the primary method, and work from home is one of those. And I think that was covered in the chat. To Chuck's question, the brief that Michael mentioned focuses primarily with ACS data, but we do have plans to start to explore the commuting module in SIP. There's a working paper or a brief kind of in process.
And if I can add very quickly,
this-
Charlene,
Sure.
there's a table package that we're working on together with the industry and occupation branch that will include some more detail on working from home in the SIP, but the release date for that is still unknown, but it's anticipated out this year.
Right, thanks. So what I want to set up for us for at least some portion of the rest of this meeting is discuss the ACS content test. So I'm going to start with describing kind of what the changes were in the last content test, what changes we have that are currently going through implementation. And then we would like to hear back from you all to hear what are some of the priorities on data that you all need or data that you would want if the question were to be modified or changed. So in 2019, the ACS modified some of the details for the means of transportation. These are considered pretty incremental changes, and they were limited to the transportation categories. You can see on the slide the pre-2019 question and then the post-2019 question. So first, we took bus or trolley bus and condensed that down to bus to be more succinct. Second was the subway or elevated rail category, and that was modified to just be subway or elevated rail. Third was the streetcar or trolley car, and that was modified to light rail, streetcar, or trolley. And then fourth, pre-2019, there was a category named railroad, and that was changed to long distance train or commuter rail. And then finally, we changed the work at home category, and we renamed it to work from home. A modification in the ordering of the previously mentioned 3 categories happened as well. So looking for changes to the 2024 ACS questionnaire was a simple modification. We added ride hailing to the taxi cab category, and then the taxi cab label was shortened to just taxi. So the 2024 ACS data, means of transportation data, will reflect the most recent category changes. So the category would be taxi and ride hailing services. So that'll be new on the 2024 questionnaire. Okay, so we've heard from the transportation community and our federal partners that there's a need for the ACS to better reflect the evolving transportation environment. And I want to kind of set up some things for us to keep in the back of our mind as we move through this discussion. So I hate to say guardrails, but essentially that's what we are going to be discussing. So in general, the ACS, it's an ongoing survey that provides vital information on a yearly basis for the nation and its people. And it's information from this survey that helps to determine federal and state funds, as you all well know. And commuting and transportation, they're among many topics used in the ACS. So the ACS, when you compare them to other transportation surveys, has a really narrow focus, and it's limited in scope just by necessity and design. So we understand that our current question, that the means of transportation question, has limitations, and we want to get additional feedback on how it could be improved. However, ACS goes through a very rigorous process to modify our survey questions. So I want to describe a little bit of what that's like. So just a broad overview of what we would go through to change the question. So I want to outline some of that. It's a process known as the ACS content test. And so it's the ACS content test process. So adding a question or making a change to the ACS, it involves extensive testing, review, and evaluation over a 5-year period. So this ensures that the change is necessary and will produce quality and useful information for the nation. So with that in mind, we work in conjunction with the Department of Commerce, and the Census Bureau does a validation of the uses for the questions to make sure there's a legal basis for them to change. So while the timing may vary depending on improvements in the testing methods or the availability of resources or the urgency of the request, the process is generally 5 years, and there are a lot of steps. There are basically 7. But in general, an agency proposes a change and works with the Census Bureau to create working options for the question. So then Census tests different ways to ask the question and collects feedback from a field test. Once that process concludes, it's then posted for public comment. And then final approval and implementation conclude the basic ACS content testing process. And remember, that takes about 5 years. So in addition to the formalized steps, there are some pragmatic things, some pragmatic considerations. Again, we'd like for you to keep in the back of your mind as we start this discussion. So for example, if this group's priority, will it impact another area? So then it becomes a multi-branch conversation that has to occur, and that adds an additional layer of complexity. So like, for example, if the discussion leans towards we need to collect every job to have every commuting trip of an employee, we would have to start consulting with other branches because there's that overlap in topics. So that's just going to add a whole nother layer of complexity. All right, so additional guardrails that we should be reminded of is that ACS is limited to a narrow focus regarding commuting, but other topics as well. And again, there are some limits to intersecting other topic areas. And today we're just going to focus on one of our commuting questions, and that's going to be the means of transportation. So just keep that in mind. Another thing to consider is that any big change, it's going to be a series break in the data. So backwards and forwards comparability could be impended based on how the question shakes out after our discussion and going through the content test. But because this process takes a considerable amount of time, our branch wants to start the conversation about what the transportation community sees as its top priorities for the means of transportation question. So I'd like to start the discussion with that. It looks like we have a lot of chats coming in. And I want this to be, as interactive as folks would like. So if there's a point you have in mind, we'll be taking notes and would like to start the conversation there. All right, does anybody have any comments?
So I would like to suggest, because question was what transportation model is most needed in terms of mode, instead of asking people trying to figure out what's their main mode of transportation, you can keep the same list of modes and ask them, how many days last week did you work from home? How many days did you drive alone? How many days do you use transit? So the same modes, the modes as they are listed are fine. Just they can give a number how many days. And because it's very popular, the hybrid mode where people are working from home 2 days and commuting 3 days, it becomes very prevalent. And to capture that, is good to know whether it's whether you're asking about a typical week or last week, it's fine, but just enumerate the modes and ask how many days they used each mode. And that way we can be more precise when we model, it'll be easier to account for work from home. Also, it gives us insight into how many people would work like 6 days a week or 4 days a week, because the sum of the days, like if you ask them how many days you telecommute, how many days did you drive last week, how many days did you use transit, then it should sum up to 5 for people who have traditional work schedules, and then we'll detect people who work 4 days or maybe 6 days. And I think that will allow continuity, because if, let's say that if that is being introduced for the next survey, if people want to do trend analysis, they can figure out from these answers, they can figure out what's the prevailing mode of transportation, and thus it will be compatible with the previous, with the older surveys, previous year surveys.
Great, thanks for that feedback.
This time, I actually would invite folks to either speak up or to type into the chat any ideas that you have to share, so that we can take this information back to fold into the next content test.
Thanks, Clara.
I know that Sherry had mentioned that she wanted to add micromobility modes to the list, although Brian responded to her. She was interested in scooters and mopeds. Just wanted to announce that, but somebody else can jump in.
Thanks, Kathy.
Oh, sorry. Are these only paper surveys? Can the survey be in an online form, whether it's on an app, on a website? Because if it's on an distributed on apps or electronically, then they can be a drop-down box, so where they can we can make sure that the number, if we ask them what they did last week on a typical week, that the number of days by different modes doesn't exceed 7. They can have a drop down to do 0, 1, 2, stuff like that. So it'd be easy to control for wrong answers on the number of days. If it's in electronic form for the paper surveys, we just have to ask them to choose, make sure that the total doesn't exceed 7.
Right, so the ACS does come in a paper format. It also is administered by field representatives that collect in-person or phone interviews. And then there's also the internet mode to collect respondent data. So all of those modes have to be, not modes of transportation, but survey modes, have to be compatible with one another. But good suggestion. Thanks for that.
Yeah, a couple questions that popped up in the chat. Somebody asked about commuting by bicycle. Yes, bicycle is an option on there already. And the other question I see is, does work from home distinguish telecommuting and, oops, it jumped on me, and home as regular workplace? And to that, I think it doesn't entirely, but it has to be 3 or more days a week.
Yeah, so the way the question is worded, it asks which one did you usually take, and we would leave it up to the respondent. Like if you commuted into your workplace 2 days a week, and then maybe you worked from home 3 days a week, the assumption is they would put work from home because that's the majority of the days they worked 5 days. And that's, I believe, the guidance we provide as well in help text to figure that out. So we don't distinguish between mixed modes. We only collect a primary mode from their primary job. And one of the nuances in the question directions are that if they use multiple modes, they're instructed to use the one that has the greatest distance. So that's the one, filtering mechanism that a respondent has. Okay, let's see.
And hey, this is Brian. I'll just jump in and say, as Charlene mentioned earlier, working from home is currently wrapped up in the other travel mode. So whether somebody works from home or, in other words, doesn't commute, or they hop on some mode of travel and commute to work, that's all captured in the same question currently. And we understand that that's not necessarily ideal. So I guess one of the challenges that we face is how do we, succinctly ask people, to differentiate between those types of commuting, and how do we gather as much information as possible while using essentially as little survey real estate as possible, and being, pithy with our questions, and hopefully gathering really informative data and distinguishing between what we know, are different types of working from home, permanent versus occasional, for example.
Looks like there was a question from Catherine. Is there any discussion of adding electronic vehicles as an option, whether car or bike, for example? And yes, thinking ahead towards the future. Currently, we're testing an electric vehicle question. I believe it's out in the field, in the field test portion. That's funnily, that's in the household branch, because it's considered a household item and not a person item, at least in the ACS survey. But they are field testing an electric vehicle. Now, not bike, but vehicle. Let's see. So in our question, we don't differentiate between electric or, combustion. We do differentiate between, drive alone and carpool, or private, I believe.
Yeah, so in the future, we'll be able to observe whether households own an electric vehicle, but not whether they are commuting with that electric vehicle. So similar to the current format where we can observe whether a household owns a vehicle, that can be associated with or cross-tabulated with their commuting mode. And one might assume that that's the vehicle they're commuting with, but it is not being considered currently as an option for the means of transportation to work question, though, of course, it's a possibility. And we assume that electric bikes as well, which I guess represent a pretty small share now, as you note in your question, they would just be classified as bicycle in the current format. There is no special category for them either.
We had some suggestions of an autonomous vehicle question, whether it's an autonomous vehicle question or if that's an option within the mode category, means of transportation category. And not directly related to the mode question, but are there any current or planned efforts to improve workplace address data quality, which is critical for Part 2 and CDP Part 3 tables?
Hey, this is Brian again.
So we're always looking.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Brian. I was just going to say, we're always looking to improve our data beyond refining some of the processes we have in place. Not at this time, but now I'm going to let Brian answer that more succinctly.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess you could improve the quality of the data in multiple ways. One is always examining, how efficient we are in gathering the information in the first place, because therein lies, the crux of the issue in terms of geocoding, right? Because we just, in a lot of cases, don't get satisfactory or any answers from a pretty good portion of respondents. And so that's something we're always looking at. We're always working that research into content tests when we can, and trying to learn from other questions, other surveys, in terms of what kind of methodology works, right down to nitty-gritty things like drop down boxes and things, and address question format. So we have explored those sorts of things in the past, including in 2 content tests ago, the 2016 content test. And I think we gathered a lot of information that we can use in the future to hopefully potentially make some changes around the margins for the actual questionnaire itself. So that's one way, just gathering more and better information from respondents. And then on top of that, the geography department and other Census Bureau divisions that are working on geocoding efforts, they are constantly examining and re-examining geocoding methodology to make sure that they're capturing as many addresses as possible. Their hit rates have gotten better and better over the years, we're happy to say. So, even though response rates seem to decline over the years, not just for this question, but pretty universally, those are somewhat compensated for in the form of, better methodology for geocoding. And finally, I guess another angle of this would be sort of tinkering with, and this doesn't relate specifically to the place where question, but all questions, tinkering with the distribution of resources as it relates to how they're spread across different types of geographies. And so, for example, in 2012, the Census Bureau redistributed resources to really focus a bit more on some of those sort of comparatively neglected rural areas that just weren't getting the sample size representation that urban areas were, really to the extent that the data was extremely thin and pretty unusable in some cases, of course, depending on which variables you're talking about. And so there's always efforts to kind of redistribute sample and resources in that way. And I guess I'll keep going, but that's a long way of saying there's no big single structural fix to this question, but there's a lot of tinkering around the margins that we hope will sort of cumulatively improve the hit rate and the quality of the data over time.
So one thing I want to remind folks that's an internal Census Bureau consideration is respondent burden. So how much time, how much effort does it take the respondent to fill out each question is a consideration and actually a parameter that we operate within. I know that historically, a lot of our commuting questions, in particularly the place of work question, is measured as having a high burden on the respondent because they have to stop, they have to think. And on a 40+ topic survey, you want to make sure that your questions are clear, concise, and that they can do it that the respondent can fill it out relatively quick. Otherwise, they're not going to give you any information potentially. So that's one of the things to keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking, through these transportation priorities. Since I see we're coming up on 3:35, I want to mention that I know today's conversation is limited in our time, but I want to make sure that, if you wanted additional time to think about it or, really take some time to consider what you would like to see. I'm going to put our contact information. I think we have it on the next slide, Michael. If you have any feedback you'd like to give to the Census Bureau, you can send it directly to me. My address is there on the slide. Really simple. My first name dot last name at census.gov. And I would be happy to take those in and put them into our working body of knowledge for how we can improve the means of transportation question. Yeah. So with that, I think we have the chats. Clara, you can correct me, but are they kept in the the recording of the meeting as well, or they come in like a printout. So I want to make sure we don't lose those.
I am planning to save the chat, and I'm not 100% sure if it's
Wonderful.
included in the recording or if it's separate, but that is my goal, is to get the chat
Okay.
out so that we will have it for exactly
Great.
the same. And I anticipate.
Thank you. I think I had, thanks. I wrote down some of the high water marks, and I know Michael has been diligently jotting things down as well. But I wanted to make sure we didn't, lose this part of the conversation, and also wanted to make sure that folks have the opportunity to get back in touch with us if they have more suggestions or want to give feedback. So thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Charlene, and thanks to everybody who either spoke or put information into the chat. It's actually very helpful as we build the case for modernizing the journey to work questions that I think have been pretty much as they are, with slight modifications, since about 1960. So that's a really, really long time. But without any further ado, I'd like to actually move on to our final speaker to make sure that she has enough time to present. Jiaxi Zhou, who is with AECOM, is going to present on commute equity, a clustering analysis on demographic characteristics and commute travel pattern. And her presentation is an outgrowth of the poster that she presented at the poster session that the Census Data Subcommittee sponsored at the annual meeting in January 2 weeks ago. Jiaxi is a traffic engineer who works for Transportation Planning Department, New York City's office. She specializes in traffic simulation, transportation planning, and data analysis for census travel modes and crashes. She has a master's degree in urban informatics from NYU and a bachelor's degree of urban planning from Chongqing University in China. So with that, I will turn it over to Jiaxi to present.
Thank you, Clara. Just to make sure, is everyone able to see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jiaxi Zhou. I'm a traffic engineer who works for AECOM Transportation Planning Department in New York City office. Today, I'm here to present my study, Commute Equity, Clustering Analysis on Demographic Characteristics and Commute Travel Patterns. This is more of like a research study from a consultant's viewpoint of how to use the data product. First of all, I want to introduce a little bit about the data. And of course, many of you are familiar with CDBB data. So the data I used here is CDBB 2012 to 2016 5-year estimate. That's the latest version available online, but I'm sure some newer version is gonna update soon. And in this study, the data majorly used is part 3, the workflow data, which we can select the original and the destination to get the demographic data, and also some equity analysis feature data. So in this project, we choose Midtown Manhattan as our workplace and also census tract in Queensboro, New York City as a residence place. So the Midtown Manhattan between 14th Street and 59th Street, it's kind of like the CBD of the whole New York City, and it can be accessible through multiple transportation modes, not just subway, cars, but also railroad and ferry boat. And the reason why I choose Queensboro is because it's the largest New York City borough by area. And also compared to Manhattan, it has more diversity. Also, because our workplace is in Manhattan, and Queens and Manhattan, there's like a East River between it. So we kind of just filter out all of the work trip that's gonna just directly walk to their workplace. And then to talk about the methodology of this study. So this study can be divided into two parts. The first part for the workflow part. First, we're gonna filter out the daily trip less than 50 per day, and then we're gonna apply a k-means clustering on the commute mode. By doing this, we are gonna divide all census tract in Queensboro into 5 different categories. And then among each category, we are gonna give a prototype of how they commute from their living space to Midtown Manhattan. And for those 5 categories of census tract, we're gonna plot out their distribution of some equity features. There are 3 major equity features that I choose. First, language isolation, and second, poverty level, and then the minority status. And we are gonna compare all those equity features one by one and among the 5 categories to see like how different they are. So for the people who's not that familiar with k-means clustering, here I do have an official like explanation of what it is. But to make long story short, k-means clustering is one of the most widely used machine learning algorithm. We can treat the value of inputs, which is a percentage of different travel pattern, as the n-dimensional coordinates for each census tract. And the algorithm is gonna determine which category it goes into based on the shortest Euclidean distance. So the benefit of this method is, first of all, we don't need to set the clustering threshold manually. I think this is very important because when we set the threshold, we kind of add on our prejudge and some bias. This method can avoid the sound of the bias by not set the threshold manually. And the second is the result is prototype. In our case, I think prototype is more reasonable to represent how the travel pattern for a category rather than just show the threshold itself. Okay, then here we come to the result of the k-means clustering. We found the 5 typical commuting patterns between residence and workplace in Midtown Manhattan. And the map here shows 5 different types. The gray area, which is limited data, like what we said previously for all the census tract with daily trip less than 50 per day, we kind of just filtered out. So the result is kind of aligned pretty well with the distribution of New York public transit. So you can see on the right side, there are 2 maps. The upper map is a map of Long Island Railroad, and the lower map is the map of subway lines in New York City. For here, the result, you can see there's a pink type along the subway line. And for here, the orange type is where a lot of Long Island Railroad station located. And then we're gonna take a deeper look into different category. So category 1, the type 1. So those type 1 census tract is the darker green one shown on the map. So because they're not the nearest, but they're still sort of like, they're kind of like a second nearest to the subway line. So subway is still the majority of the way that people choose to go to work. And there's still like 11% by bus because some of the locations like here, the access to the subway line is not as convenient as those census tract that directly along the subway line. Just to make it clear here for the other mode, we include ferry boat, bicycle, and work from home, stuff like that. That's because during this analysis, because it's 2012 and 2016 data, the percentage of people during the using the other mode is add up together is less than 2%. So I just aggregate them together. the type 2 category. The type 2 category, we can see here, a lot of people is taking the railroad. So from the map, type 2 is the orange census tract that locates here. It makes a lot of sense is because this is the location that Long Island Railroad has multiple station locates here. So people can get to Midtown Manhattan very fast and convenient by railroad. So people would prefer to choose railroad instead of subway. And type 3 here, which is the pink type on the map, which shows like people who live right along the subway line. So of course, more than 90% of people would choose subway as their major travel pattern to work. And type 4, we can see that type 4 is a light green on the map. So type 4 compared to type 1 and type 3, they're kind of far from the subway line, which means directly walk to the subway might be a little bit inconvenient for them. So a lot of them will shift from subway to bus, which they might have a bus location nearby. It's more accessible for them to take bus instead of subway. And type 5 is the yellow type on the map. They really located somewhat far from the major public transit. So a lot of them would choose to drive to work. So we got 5 prototype of how people choose to travel to work. Then we're gonna do an equity analysis and comparison on their poverty level, minority status, and language isolation. So here I plot those like the average of 5 different types, like the type 1, type 2. Here we're gonna compare among those 3 different features. From this plot, we can easily find that the poverty level distribution and the language isolation distribution, they are very similar. So both of them, in both distribution, the type 2 people has the lower portion of poverty level and the lower portion of language isolation. And then the type 3 people has the highest of percentage of people who below poverty level and the highest percentage of people who with language isolation. And those 2 different type are kind of like different because type 2, if you guys still remember, those are people who live next to the Long Island Railroad, and type 3 is the people who live along the subway line system. So why is that different? I guess that's because, so in New York City, the Long Island Railroad, it's kind of like a public transit that can only be used for commute purpose. So it can make you conveniently travel from your leave place to Manhattan, but it does not have too many stops in between. So usually people live in that neighborhood, they still need to own a car if they want to go somewhere else. Like for example, if they want to go shopping, go entertainment in the weekend, they still need to own a car. But type 3 people who live along the subway system is kind of like they rely the subway line for everything. So subway is not just the type of travel mode they use for commute, but they basically use it for everything. And it is more convenient for people who below poverty level to do it. So I talk about the key findings of this study, and also, of course, there are some limitation and future improvements can be made here. The first of all is right now, the comparison of equity analysis is for all people, the demographic feature for all people versus the people who commute to Midtown Manhattan. But can the people who work in Midtown Manhattan represent the people the all people who commute in this census tract, that's a question mark and can be explored in the future. And also, I'm very glad to hear that the CDPP data is gonna have an updated version, because right now the current version is from 2016 to 2012 to 2016. And of course, it's before COVID. I think COVID is gonna have a large difference, a large influence on people, how they want to like travel to work and the way they work. Last but not least, there are other demographic features can be dived into. Not just the equity feature that I choose, but also like median income, vehicle availability, and stuff like that. And thanks for your time and listening, and let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you, Joshi. Kathy, are there any questions in the chat?
There aren't any questions in the chat at this time. Wait, actually, somebody just wrote, David wrote, can you just explain language isolation again?
So I think in this case, isolation, it really means, do you speak English or not? So people who does not speak English at all is be recognized as a language isolated. So it will be hard for them to find jobs and to work and to communicate with other people.
Great.
Okay. And someone else, so in other words, you mean language limited LAP, limited English proficiency? It's most likely. Would that be correct?
Yes.
You had mentioned vehicle availability as one of the things. Are there other features you were looking into for future analysis? Anything else besides that?
I would think about maybe median income and perhaps like how many years have you stayed in United States? Those are all also like other features can be dived into.
Okay. Right now, I don't have any more questions in the chat box.
Okay.
Okay. Actually, at this time, so we have a few more minutes before the meeting is scheduled to end. I guess we can open it up to questions to any and all of our presenters to for any questions that were not answered earlier, either in the chat or verbally before we wrap up. But I actually am going to share the last slide. So that and this slide just has our wrap-up information. Just to announce, we've actually migrated the subcommittee website onto a site that is hosted by AASHTO. And unfortunately, the link's a little long, but you can see it there, ctpp.transportation.org. And it's TRB AED20, which is our official number in the TRB structure. So you can use that link to access the presentations and the recording afterwards. Kathy and I will be putting that up, and it'll probably take us a few days, so give us a little bit of time, but we can announce that out via the listservs and our friends list. And to that, if you are not on our friends list, please, and you want to be, please email Kathy and or me, and we can add you to our list. We don't share it, we don't sell it, we just use it for announcements relating to Census Data Subcommittee business. And a couple other little things. We do often generally put out a call for posters for the annual meeting. And this is outside the formal paper structure that TRB utilizes for populating sessions be them podium or poster. So this is just posters. And we put that call out generally in July so that the poster session can be part of the annual meeting. And Jashi is, her poster was part of that process. So I invite you to sort of keep your eye out on the CTPP and or the Team Up listservs for that announcement next summer. And I already mentioned to be, if you want to be included on our mailing list, go ahead and send us your email address. If you have any other questions or if you have any ideas for future presentations that you would like to see from the subcommittee, go ahead and email Kathy and me.
One question came through. The Census Bureau released the 2019 PUMs with experimental weights, as well as the 2020 PUMs with experimental weights. Is there a Bureau style guide to discuss 2019X, 2020X, and 2019, 2021 regular PUMs? I don't know if Vincent or Chris could answer, or anybody.
This is Chuck. I'm basically trying to figure out how to both graphically as well as in text explain this kind of bridge between the 2019 to 2021, because I think the 2020, say, workers working at home is very indicative of what's happening over these 2-year time spans. I just don't have a good feel of how to express this graphically and verbally.
Sadly, this
Chuck, if you want to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Vince.
No, I don't have any info on PUMs where I don't know much about them. I work on PUMAs for the PUMs data, but not the PUMs data itself.
Chuck, I was going to say, if you want to shoot me an email, I'll see if I can point you to some language that we might have publicly available for that.
Okay, that was Charlene speaking?
Yeah, Charlene. Mhm.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Thanks, Chuck.
A previous question for Vincent or Chris was, the latest loads data lags the census. Do you anticipate much change over time? Seems like there was a reference to how some of the urban areas were looking at LAHD or loads.
I mean, the main thing is I think the loads data isn't reflecting COVID yet and the pandemic. So the use from what we saw in the delineation, I think, was still okay. But I do expect the loads data going forward will show something from that. Lord knows what in the splitting, because when we implemented the data, since it's at the block level, and we use like a mid-range output, that it's pretty, like some places like Florida were close to unusable in their splitting, because, and we had some strange results we needed to really work through, where we have like blocks with small population and they basically were teleworking back to their corporate or government headquarters. And so, you'll get someone in Maryland coded to Connecticut UA. So that kind of stuff we really had to scrub out and find the more general patterns in it. It still worked really well in most areas, but I imagine that kind of thing is going to get worse when the pandemic results are more in those data sets. So.
One other question was, will all future Census 2020 and ACS data releases include these new UA definitions, including the DHC to be released next month, March 2023?
Correct. that was is our driving factor for getting them defined when we do, is to get into the DHC release or SF in the past census. And then, yes, they're reflected, but we had brought up the point that, you know, ideally there would be another delineation in the mid-decade to reflect actual urban expansion, maybe built off the existing UAs, and why we used housing counts to do it in our delineation, but we don't have any plan or funding to do a mid-decade. So these 2020 UAs will be the ones in the 2020 products as well as ACS going forward until the next delineation.
I think we have time for one more question.
You want me to throw one out?
Sure.
Are exempted territories still at 5 miles?
Yes, limit. So anywhere within there.
Okay. Should we stop there, Claire?
Yep, I want to be respectful of folks' time. So thank you for joining us. Like I said, if you have any questions about anything at all with respect to today, go ahead and shoot Kathy and me an email at our email addresses on the screen. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending. We greatly appreciate your time and your listening. And we will be posting everything, and we'll send out once we've posted the presentations and the recording on the website. So with that, I think we're done. Thank you.